Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Wakamoto. I'm the chairman of the Department of Conservation. No, can't even think of it now. Yeah, there's so many words in there. Ecosystem and Conservation Science here at the University of Montana, and then all that's within the College of Forestry and Conservation, our new organization. I have the pleasure this afternoon of introducing one of my doctoral students who should finish up pretty shortly, and that's what we're excited about. I'd like to introduce Victoria Yazzie, who is currently she's the assistant to the director of the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona State University. Northern Arizona University, excuse me. Victoria first came here after receiving a master's, or a bachelor's and a master's from NAU. I think back now when she came here, it was in February, and I think if she shut her eyes, she could go outside and kind of see that all over again. I want to tell you that it was 50 degrees colder than it is right now when she came, and I'm sure she thought she was near the end of the earth. And her relatives, who she called every night, felt that same way. Victoria's done a number of other things after leaving Missoula itself. She has taught at New Mexico Highlands University, and she's done a lot of other things. We traveled the country representing WICHE, Western Interstate Compact for Higher Education, in the Compact for Faculty Diversity. I feel very fortunate we got to run around in New Orleans before all these things happened with Katrina. We got to do that twice because of that organization. Victoria, while she was here, did a number of things here for the benefit of Native American students, and I kind of like to list some of those here because I think they're very important to us. She was the president and the founder of the Native American Graduate Student Association. At the same time, she was the vice president for the Graduate Student Association for the entire campus. She's a member of the Indian Development Council. A lot of things there that, I don't know, she found the time to be able to give of herself to improve the campus. And the fact that we're having this conference here today, for me, is kind of a fruition that we've maybe hopefully turned the corner and really supporting those various kinds of programs and graduate students here at the University of Montana. Today she's going to talk about fire and restoration ecology, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Victoria Yazzie.
Thank you. Hello, she Victoria Yazzie Hinishia. Ashin Hedo Kiani Bashishchin. Twinnes isn't it Dan Nasha. My name's Victoria. I'm born from my mother, Salt, born from my father, Tall House Clan, and I'm originally from Tuba City, born in Gouldings, Utah. My grandmother is from the Sanasti region of the Lucachicay Mountains in eastern Arizona next to Shiprock. My grandfather was born in Blue Canyon, Arizona, near Tuba City. And when they met, they did something atypical of Navajo culture and tradition. She uprooted herself and went to live with my grandfather in the western side. We just celebrated on February 11th her 95th birthday. Her middle name is Nazba, which means female warrior. And anyway, I have 4 children. They went to school with me, and I raised them through my master's and through my PhD program. And I was really fortunate enough to be here in western Montana to work on the Confederate Salish and Kootenai Reservation. Today what I'm going to talk about is I think we pretty much understand what traditional ecological knowledge is, that it's an experimental, learned activity. It's not something that just you learn it, then it ends. It's something that's continuous throughout your life that you learn and adapt with. And Navajos are very, very adaptable people. They, for many years, of course, the theory says that we're We came through the Bering Strait and then down toward Arizona. And 2 tribes separated. One band went coastal and the other one went through the United States to meet up at the very bottom, and we never met up. But I think what happened was a lot of the Navajos probably got integrated in other tribes. So let me go ahead and begin. Anyway, as Ron said, I am from Northern Arizona University, which is in Flagstaff, Arizona. I work very closely with Wally Covington. We have 3 phases in the Ecological Restoration Institute, that is of education, research, and outreach. And we do it on different levels. We have hardcore, we go from pinon juniper, restoration concepts to subalpine fir. And our outreach program basically is working with education and direct contact with agency groups and tribal groups in the Southwest. Wally Covington was instrumental in developing the 3 institutes, one in Colorado State University under Dan Binkley, the other one at New Mexico Highlands University, and then of course Northern Arizona University, which has been there for more than 10 years. So we're doing a lot of restoration in the Southwest. One of my primary goals today is to give you a historical overview of the influence of the National Forest management, National Forest laws and policies that affect Indian reservations. Take a look at the congressional laws and the tribal policies, and take a look at what we call ecosystem management and adaptive ecosystem management and its generalities, and what is ecological restoration. And then take a look at the unique tribal view of our environment. And then how do we integrate this Native American perspective in natural resource management, science, law, and policy. And if you have any questions, we'll go from there. So the historical perspective of policy on public lands, now this is not tribal lands, this is strict federal lands, BLM, US Forest Service. Back in its initial phase, the U.S. Forest Service grew out of the utilitarian perspective of Gifford Pinchot in 1898 when the U.S. Forest Service became, was in its initial stages of becoming the U.S. Forest Service. And its primary purpose of the Organic Act was to protect preserves for commodity benefit as wood production. Then came along the sustained yield management law in 1960, whereby the U.S. Forest Service was mandated by Congress to take a look at, to incorporate more non-commodity uses, and later amended in 1976 to include renewable and non-renewable resources, for instance, like intellectual, spiritual, aesthetics, those types of values in their land use management. With the Monongahela incident, the National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service went and pretty much outlawed the Organic Law and went Organic Act and adopted the National Forest Management Act of 1976, which embraces a more holistic approach to resource management. So what really changed the perspective of the U.S. Forest Service was one particular decision with the Fourth Circuit Court in West Virginia versus Isaac Walton League of America Incorporated versus Butts, whereby the U.S. Forest Service was challenged on their clear-cutting techniques. They didn't like what was happening, so they were taken to court. And what happened initially is they argued basically that the U.S. Forest Service needed to take into account other qualities of life, and one of those is within the ecosystem management approach is the diversity of systems. And what happened was, as a compromise, the U.S. Forest Service went and adapted the National Forest Resource Management Act. In particular, the clear-cutting, basically the clear-cutting said that it was in violation of the Organic Act simply because the Organic Act was intended to preserve the national forests. And they didn't feel like they were doing that because they were replacing a certain type of tree species, taking off a tree species and putting on another one and changing the whole biotic system. So they replaced it with the National Forest Resource Management Act. Then, with all the Leopold's idea, during that period of time in history in the United States, people were kind of taking a look at their environment. They were trying to figure out, after the post-World War era of just stripping the timber off the landscapes, people were starting to take a look at the effects of those chemicals, with Rachel Carson and all those guys, on how do we perceive the landscape. And Aldo Leopold at the University of Wisconsin and others, John Curtis and, oops. Back arrow. Okay. Aldo Leopold's eloquent statement in the Sand County Almanac, which is not unlike Native American philosophy already, pretty much states that all ethics so evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community with interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of communities to include soil, water, plants, animals, and collectively the land. It is inconceivable that any ethical relationship to the land can exist without love, respect, and admiration. That is not different than Native American philosophy. And one thing that really strikes me about having to prove traditional ecological knowledge in the world that we live in today is because the majority of our laws are hard law cases that come from the US government, which is a completely different law system than traditional Native people. So we're learning how to deal with what law is in natural resource management. And another thing too is that we come from an oral tradition, things that are passed down through learning and experience. And in the society of academia and the society of law, you must write. You have to write. And oftentimes that's very, very difficult for Native American people to do because it's outside their normal societal, cultural realm, sphere. Well, ecosystem management basically emphasizes a holistic view of the relationship between human beings and the biotic community for long-term sustainability. And this kind of extends far beyond the commodity uses. It includes aesthetic, intellectual, perceptual, and even spiritual meaning and satisfaction. With tribal forests, so the initial beginning of the U.S. Forest Service laws that pertain to public land had a utilitarian history, and more recently are taking a look at incorporating a lot more than those other things than just commodity resources. And so currently, the tribal forests were basically influenced by this utilitarian perspective because we didn't really have our laws until recently. Okay? There are 193 reservations in 33 states. 16.8 million acres are forest land and 9.3 million acres are woodlands. 5.7 million acres of forest management of the forests are in forest production. In 1991, Indian forests generated more than $465 million and 40,000 jobs, and then $180 million and 9,000 jobs in the non-Indian population. So you can see the substantial value of Indian forest management. There are a couple of laws that pertain directly to tribal forests. And the reason why I'm doing that is because oftentimes it still takes on that utilitarian approach. Indians could only take dead and down for a long period of time. It wasn't until 1964 with the Indian Timber Sales Act that we were allowed to actually harvest on our landscapes. The Code of Federal Regulations in Title 25, labeled Indians, is basically is the law that governs what happens in resource forest management on Indian lands. The most important one that regulates forest management on all tribal lands is the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act of 1990. And I'd like to cover just a little bit of the National Environmental Policy Act and how that, how more specifically, a lot of people don't, in the public lands, cannot really implement NEPA because it's really complicated. But in Indian country, it takes a different role. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1979 basically is an act that says, okay, you have the inherent right to self-governance, and also outlined and redirected the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a trust responsibility. And the Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1994 further outlined the details of the Bureau of Indian Affairs with tribal government relationship, which causes 638 contracts, which is Public Law 638, 93-638. And then more recently, which brings Native American tribes into more of a partnership and collaborative role rather than consultant, is the Tribal Forest Protection Act of 2004. Okay? And so how do we, as Indian people, integrate what we consider a Native American land ethic within our natural resource management? And ecosystem management has threefold. It takes a look at the biological, the social, and the technological aspects of management. Okay? 2 out of 3 of those aspects are measurable. How does anybody measure value? How would you measure what you perceive your landscape to be if, in fact, you consider yourself as part of that landscape as the earth as a living soul, and we were born of that earth as spirit children? And then, given that, we have an obligation to care for the land and to sustain the earth's elements. And then above all, respect is essential for the survival of tribes and our communities. Okay? So then how do we, our culture is based on traditional values founded in the oral stories of inanimate earth surface creatures. Okay, that are very much a part of our lives. Traditional ecological knowledge, or indigenous knowledge, or whatever things that they call it, or place-based knowledge, which I prefer to use, is a way. How do we then integrate all of this knowledge base that's unmeasurable into on-ground resource management? Okay. The National Environmental Policy Act, of course, is applicable in Indian country and has a role that's unlike other, which allows that social cultural aspect of forest management to be a part of on-ground forest management. The Council of Environmental Quality was basically our basic charter, and they went and established the regulations for the National Environmental Policy Act. And NEPA is binding on all federal agencies, regardless. If you get federal funds, you do NEPA. If you're on federal lands, you do NEPA. If you're on tribal lands, you do NEPA. Okay? And it provides, basically allows for citizens and meaningful substantive rights to be in part, and requires the opportunities for tribes to participate in federal agency decision making. And tribes are mandated by the Code of Federal Regulations to comply with NEPA. And basically what it does, it allows for direct social impacts and cultural impacts on tribal reservations. NEPA itself, in regards to Indian lands, said, "It is the continuing responsibility of the federal government to use all practicable means to improve and coordinate federal plans, functions, programs, and resources to the end the nation may fulfill the responsibilities of each generation as trustees for successful generations. Every decision we make reflects consideration of the seventh generation to come." So the perspective has been gained from short-term commodity uses to maybe a long-term role and guide. So then how does NEPA apply on Indian Reservation? It provides an avenue for developing multi-resource objectives and environmental review for proposed timber sales and other forestry-related activities. It provides for an interdisciplinary approach. It allows for a thorough analysis of potential environmental impact statements due to harvesting techniques, including impacts to wildlife, protection of cultural resources, habitat fragmentation issues, lake serial habitat retention, etc. So I just threw a couple in there I thought would be good. Potential for compliance to all other laws. And what other laws do you think would be useful? The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, you know, those types of laws. And it's an avenue whereby tribes may instruct federal agencies to coalesce their cultural integrity into on-ground resource management. Now, tribes, of course, have that role with the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act, in that one particular law basically put the Bureau of Indian Affairs in a trust responsibility and allowed the tribes to do 638 contracts for all their negotiations. So then how do we then balance traditional values within forest resource management when we have the inherent right to control forest resources under the Tribal Self-Governance Act? You know, there are several other things I thought would be really interesting, is that NEPA basically, along with the NIFMA, it allows us to get more stumpage from our wood. Okay, whereas before it wasn't like that at all. Now we can go ahead and sell our lumber for fair market value. And it reduces the exploitation of timber on our landscapes. It protects our sacred sites. You can incorporate ecological processes, and we heard a lot about that today, about ecological processes and functions. And then we can minimize habitat fragmentation while embracing a cultural ethic or value that is more conducive, or that emulates our tribal perspective. And each tribe is different with that. Ecological restoration, basically, and I'm just kind of throwing all these concepts, and I'll gather it all up a little bit later, is that ecological restoration came out of a variety of different groups of people. Aldo Leopold from the University of Wisconsin, John Curtis, all of those guys. And what they took a look at is they said that organisms, communities, and ecological systems have adapted over evolutionary time to the structures and processes which they have encountered. Okay? Ponderosa pine, in particular, in the Southwest, have been characterized by open park-like structure driven by light surface fires from 2 to 12 years between fires. And because of fire suppression, grazing, road building, all of those things that we do as humans have caused certain changes within the natural fire regime, thus affecting the ecosystems of ponderosa pine. And some of those things that are very evident now, that we have an increase in tree density, especially in small diameter trees. we have a decrease in herbaceous and shrub production. If all the growing space is up on the top, you're not going to have anything at the bottom, right? And you have a decrease in the diversity of net primary production because it's all locked up. You have a disruption of the organic matter and processing and nutrient cycling. You have increase in fuel ladder buildup. You have increase in patch and landscape crown fuel hazard occurrence. And you have a decrease in tree vigor. You have increase in tree mortality due to insects and disease attack because of the low vigor of some of the trees. And you have ecosystem simplification at all levels in the biotic and landscape hierarchy. That means you're getting all the same kind of looking landscape. It's all the same. It looks all the same, okay? There's no diversity vertically or horizontally. It's all the same. Now, some of the cultural perspectives, if you think about your tribes, somebody said, why aren't there any elders at this conference? You know? I thought about that a little bit. And oftentimes, you know, as being a forest manager and going to the interdisciplinary team meetings, it's very difficult at times for elders to be able to conceptualize what natural resource managers are saying. So because we speak in acronyms, we speak with words that are outside of their normal language. We don't speak in their language. One thing that I'm really fortunate to have is we have on the Navajo reservation 350,000 Navajos, and more than 80% of those Navajos speak their language, and it's their first language. So when you go into a chapter meeting and you're going to go ahead and present maybe a proposal for a forest resource management plan, that is all done in Navajo. And what is very, very difficult to do as a forester is to translate what we perceive as sound forest management to an elder lady who says, no, we want large trees. You know, you have to interpret those types of things and try to visually and conceptually bring that picture into her mind of what you want to have or what she wants in your mind, you know, and to try to do that type of forest resource management. Oftentimes, tribal members have concerns over the long-term sustainability of forest health conditions on their landscape. There are too many beetles, there are too many bugs out there. You know, we have root rot, you know, all these types of things. They know what's happening on their landscape because they go out there. They're out there picking berries, they're out there doing something on the landscape, and they can see all of this. Why do the trees have mistletoe? You know, all of that. So they have these long-term health condition concerns. And that their physical environment and biotic resources may support a productive forest during at least some serial stages. That means if you have a homogeneous area of just all even-aged management, they say, there are no young trees growing up. You know, where are all the young trees? You know, what's happening to them? So their concern is, where do the elk go? Where do the, you know, how do we interact with our landscape? And why are all the trees are all the same size? They have concerns over that. And so you have to interpret it. Do you want to have a variety of different sizes and trees out there? They say, we want to see the old trees, but we also want to see the young ones coming up. So as foresters, you have to interpret that into the type of management scheme that they would like on their landscape. Then they also want to know that they want to reduce the changes, the fast changes in their landscapes. And then they want to know how these trees or these plants or these animals can respond to those changes at a landscape level. Okay? And some of the other concerns that I've noticed, and these are the technical issues that we do as foresters, is to kind of translate what they're trying to say into words in English. And so you see, you want a functional equilibrium between supply and demand of all the essential things: water, nutrients, light, growing space, for a major portion of the landscape, the vegetation. And you want a diversity of cereal stages, so that and stand structure that can provide habitat for many indigenous species and all essential ecosystems. So if you go ahead and supply a diversity of cereal stages and stand structure, what does it allow for your future generation to do? If I do just even age management, and Clarice says, I don't want even age management, does it allow for her to have a variety or dynamics of cereal stages out on the landscapes to do a different type of manipulation if she wants to? It limits her on what she wants to do on the landscape. So therefore, we try to give our progeny an opportunity to put the environment on a trajectory that's more typical of them, and that's called adaptive ecosystem management. Okay. Now then, how do we then introduce ecological restoration concepts on the landscape? With the outreach program, this is in Black Pinnacle on the Navajo Indian Reservation. And we went out to give them a demonstration of what we perceived ecological restoration to be in ponderosa pine habitat types. Okay? So we had this group that was out there. Okay? And what we did was, we looked for those trees that were evidence trees prior to disruption. So you're looking at the early 1800s, right? And we're looking for prior to fire exclusion, prior to grazing, prior to road building, prior to all of that. When we started prior to change in ponderosa pine types. So we looked at stumps, we took a look at holes in the ground where old trees used to be. We even took those evident trees. On the Navajo Reservation, we are very lucky to have large yellows left. So what we did was we flagged all the large yellows. We wanted to keep them. Why? They're not good for harvesting anymore. Why? History? Because the majority of them are hollow inside because of heart rot. Okay, so when you cut them down, you're wasting a big yellow. So why cut down something that's not going to give you any commercial value? They're going to lose that stumpage. So what we did was we decided to keep them because that's what culturally people want to see. And it takes a heck of a long time to grow one of those trees. So you keep them.
Is it ecologically sound though? Is it taking something?
It is satisfying. It is satisfying that cultural perspective by keeping them. It is not economically feasible as a forester to leave them. You know, it's not good silvicultural practice. But we left them. So we got them. We went and tagged them. You know, we put the orange on there. See the little orange tags there? And then what we did was, the idea and concept of ecological restoration on ground is to try to find the function and structure and the processes that were typical of that landscape. So we kept the old yellows, because with photos, historic photos, you see that there are probably, I didn't put any in there, you see that there are old yellows in these old photos. around Flagstaff area on the Chusca Mountains. So you keep the yellow pines of 175 plus years. We mark them. And then what we did according to the management strategy, we asked the foresters, what is your forest management plan? What do you want to see? How many residual trees do you want? Because that yellow is going to die. You want to replace it when it dies with one of these things out here, one of those other trees. So the forester went out there and they said, okay, we don't want mistletoe, you know? So they looked at the trees that didn't have mistletoe. They looked at the trees that weren't forked or damaged by porcupine, the ones that look healthy. By, you know, when you're in the forest, you can tell those types of things. So they went and chose replacement trees per each one of those yellows. They said, we want 2-to-1 ratio, 2 residual trees to 1 evidence tree. So that's what we did. So we tagged them with green. Right there. So their management plan was going from 110 plus basal area, the numbers of trees per area, to 30 to 40. That was their initial management plan. So by finding those evidence trees, they replaced them with these green tagged trees, the residual, the ones that they wanted to keep after they harvested on ground, and it turned out that their basal area was 37 square feet. They did this on their own. This was cool. So on the Fort Defiance Plateau, which is one of the most sacred deities on the Navajo Reservation, one of them in the landscape level, on the Defiance Plateau, this is what they would like to see. And what happened was, the Defiance Plateau, way back when, their silvicultural technique was this type of harvesting method, because the old people wanted to see the old yellows, and they remember that when they rode their horses, the grass was up past their knees. So this was during the period of the extra-grill in maybe 1960s and 70s. So that's what the Defiance Plateau looks like. So what it did was allowed for a little bit of understory regeneration, kept the old yellows, satisfied cultural ideas and perspective, and increased the grass production by 400 pounds per acre. So then what we did at Black Pinnacle is we went out there and we GPS'd all the existing trees. So all the evidence trees were GPS'd, and all the red ones there, these red dots, are all the trees that we left that fell within the natural fire regime before it was interrupted by fire suppression and grazing and all that. And then what we did was we went back in there with the yellow, with the green, and GPS'd all the 2-to-1 ratio trees out there on just that little plot. And then we took them all out as if we were going to harvest the whole area, just to leave the residuals, including the Gamble Oak Mountains. So that gave us the replacement tree a picture of what it was going to look like on ground after manipulation. So that is one of the ways of trying to negotiate between what sound forest management is, what tribal perspective individual cultural people want, and then the result of what we did on ground. Okay. Sometimes the laws within even the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act, the laws say that we want to take into account all those cultural resources. What are cultural resources? I have no idea what cultural resource is, but I can tell you what cultural traditional use is. Okay, so as indicators of trying to figure out what cultural integrity may be, you can formulate some indicators of what that one element is. Okay, so when you take a look at cultural uses, you look at hunting, berry gathering, how many times you go out into the forest, why you go out into the forest, you know, those types of things. Those questions people are willing to answer and give you information about. So that would be one indicator of what cultural integrity may be. What would be the another indicator of cultural integrity?
I would say the use of the, like when you said it, the grass has started to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's going to be an increase of your herbivores coming in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's just maybe that experience and that oral, those stories that people can tell you about that landscape. And you know what, that's really important because it's a self-identification of that landscape. You have a personal investment in that landscape. And so, you know, Native American people are stuck on a reservation right now, right? We're there. We can't just get up after we utilize everything and go somewhere else. That's all we have. So a lot of that place-based knowledge is very valuable when in determining what cultural integrity is. Okay. One of the, when you look at a culture itself, I mean, if you say, okay, Connie, what is important to you as a Native American? Language, family, tradition, you know. So you have a basic understanding of what it is that requires you to have that sort of integrity, right? Okay. One of the other things that would be a measure or an indicator of a cultural integrity would be, for instance, your belief system. If it were not the fact that Native Americans have that close relationship with the landscape, they wouldn't have that long-term investment to make sure that they have some sort of sustainability for their progeny. Okay? We can't just pack up and go somewhere else. Beam me up, Scotty. You know, we can't do that. So we have a long-term investment. There's one particular tribe in Wisconsin that Marshall P. Corps has the opportunity to forest manage, is the Menominee Tribal Enterprises. And for over 150 years, they have practiced sustained yield forest management. And I believe that they were the first green certified group in the United States. And how they got to that point was when their elders said, we're going to harvest from one end to the setting sun and then back again. He didn't say we're going to go ahead and practice, you know, rotation of the types of trees, and we're going to take the worst and leave the best. So in those simplistic terms, you know, we can go ahead and integrate that knowledge base, that place-based knowledge of our Indian people into on-ground forest resource management. Okay. Do you guys have any questions? But anyway, at the Ecological Restoration Institute, we do several things. We work to heal fire-adapted forests and ecosystems in Western North America. And we provide the best applied restoration knowledge to the public, land agencies, and non-governmental organizations, academic researchers, and students. We focus on science-based restoration treatments that return forests to ecological health while reducing threats of unnatural fire. Okay. One of the most important laws that has happened, which Intertribal Timber Council really lobbied for, was the Tribal Forest Protection Act. And what that does, before all of this happened, the way that the U.S. Forest Service or the BLM their contact with tribes was to send the tribes a disc or 150-page paper and saying, okay, this is the EIS, what do you think? And they would label that as their consultant. We've consulted the tribes. What the Tribal Forest Protection Act does of 2004, it forces that direct collaborative partnership role that tribes have that affects their landscape adjacent to public lands. Now remember, tribal lands are not public lands. Okay, when I say public lands, we're looking at U.S. Forest Service, BLM. And what it does is allows for that one-to-one base for tribes to sit at the table and take a look at what type of management they want for those buffer zones, okay? And what lands, of those lands that are important to tribes, because a lot of the tribes up here, like for instance the Nez Perce, have ceded lands that are valuable to them. They're Aboriginal territorial lands. So if we're taking a look at what cultural use is and what their philosophy or epistemology of their landscape may be, then tribes have an obligation to try to give an idea of what they consider forest management to be on those lands that are adjacent to theirs. It's a big major step. It's a big major step. In Arizona, we have the statewide strategic assessment that the Ecological Restoration Institute is working on. And what that is taking a look at landscape-based management on large landscapes. And one of those is to take a look and bring the tribes up front and say, what would you like to see? What is your management strategy? And what happens oftentimes is the tribes don't want to sacrifice what they consider cultural use. They don't want to do that. The thing that I feel that is essential is to have those forest managers articulate what tribal management is and a strategy. Because you can go ahead and say, okay, we want a diversity of cereal stages, you know. That means here in Montana, a cereal species would be western larch and ponderosa pine in a low-intensity fire regime. Am I correct? So then when they say cereal stages, a diversity of cereal stages, that means to me that somehow you are going to put a different type of age groups across the landscape to allow for manipulation in the future. That's what I would do on forest management. You know, and then go back to the tribe and ask, is this what you want to see? Click, click. You know, best way to show them is with a picture or take them out into the woods.
Big stopping plots.
Yeah, that's where, you know, with the NEPA process and trying to get tribal members to participate, because you get a lot of complaining if you do some sort of management plan, and all you hear is a lot of complaining. Elders never came out, you know, young people complaining because you didn't do it exactly. Where were they in the process of the scoping meetings? You know, and I think that's what's really important to instill within our children, is to try to have them come out and play an active role. Go to them. You know, go to the chapter house, you know, set a meeting, maybe multitudes of meetings so it can accommodate a large variety of communication between the elders and the youth and everybody else, you know. I think that's a really important role. And it takes a lot of time, it takes commitment, and it takes a lot of time of that resource manager to be able to do that. Okay. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Victoria? I've got this mic here. Here, Cass.
I don't know, it might be off the subject a little bit, but when you was talking about raising stumpage costs and stuff like that, is that for everybody, is that including tribal members that want to go out there and harvest trees to live a sustainable life? And I have a two-part question, but yeah, that's the first part.
I think your reservation is a little bit different because individual tribal members can go out and harvest a certain amount of timber that belongs, that they can make into a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the Confederate Salish, is that the reservation you're talking about?
Yeah, we can do that, but there's a very long waiting list, but yes. And, another question that I have is for, like, getting more tribal members, like, involved, or getting them a job. Let's say, for instance, let's say a couple tribal members were working for Plum Creek, and the tribe says that you have to have at least this many tribal members employed for you to cut on our lands. And with raising the stumpage and stuff like that, would it be more motivational, for instance, Plum Creek, to hire tribal members if you were to raise the stumpage only if they were cut, if the tree was cut by a non-tribal member, and lower the stumpage cost if they were cut by a tribal member? But yet the company is profiting either way. But
I don't think it makes a difference who cuts down the tree. It's what the market economy will pay the tribes for that timber. And I think the tribes need to be a little bit more proactive to want more money for their trees. And that's the reason why, like Menominee can go override the market economy and go to Japan, because Japan can pay more for their hardwood trees than, say, the United States will, wherever it may be.
And with my question, I was leaning more towards trying to get tribal members, keeping them employed, keeping them, give them a for sure job on the reservations.
Oh.
Why do you see so many tribal members cutting logs?
Why do I say?
They get lower stumpage costs than other people, and we get lower costs because we cut on our natural lands. So if a Sioux was to come in,
I see what you're talking
they
about.
charge more stumpage for, let's say they're selling 25 tons to Plum Creek, or I'm selling 6 tons to Orley, an Amish guy to make post and pole. I have to pay, you know, 40, 50 bucks, whatever, 10 bucks a ton or something. So we do pay less being tribal members cutting on our res. So yeah, we do get paid less.
But
Yeah.
That's because there's no other market than Plum Creek to buy
Now, if you
from.
was to go harvest your 10,000 board feet yourself, you won't have to pay stumpage, 'cause that's
Yeah, you won't. That'll be just free.
But in turn, having Plum Creek employ people like that, the tribal members don't have to use their own vehicles to do this, buy their own chainsaws to cut down the timber, spend their own gas money to go up there and harvest.
Well, the tribe needs to get their own lumber mill, to tell you the truth. We need to get our own mill and produce our own thing, instead of having to pay Plum Creek or Stimson to log it and haul it, and we get a little bit of it.
Only a fraction.
Yeah,
Yes, with that I understand, but keeping the majority of getting more tribal members out there employed in the job market.
I think Kirsten probably answered that,
Yeah, working on the res is,
because I don't know much about that part of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai.
yeah, that's.
And
what- yeah.
he works.
Yeah, I've done it.
The Cass is talking about stumpage price to
Tribal members.
Well, but that's a separate deal. He's saying, what about offering Plum Creek a deal if they hire so many folks from the reservation that we give them a different percentage of that stumpage price? That's the right to cut the tree, for those who aren't familiar with that. But,
Well, that's the same concept of a tribal selling it to Plum Creek, paying a less fraction.
but they're selling logs. We're talking about stumpage, the right to cut the tree,
Yeah.
and not taking all the other, you've got various, I can't think of the term. If you're injured on the job, all those costs are part of what the company pays, and yet they can still employ people, as opposed to
Then you're gonna have to get
tribal
certifications and
enterprise
everything.
taking the
Yeah.
risk, I
Well,
guess.
none of the tribal are trying to certify to do all that, you know.
Hmm?
We need to get certified probably.
You know what I would recommend is probably propose that to your tribal forest manager, that option, and then he takes it to the tribal council for approval.
Okay.
Other questions for Victoria? Well, I have one.
Oh, go, no!
Because it's always bothered me. In some ways, it's bothered me. In some ways, I recognize the value of the timber resource for the tribes now. It's very important, particularly in the Southwest. But I've always said in class that when Native people were burning, they were creating a cultural landscape. They weren't growing trees. That's not what they were doing. They were burning in their traditional ways to get the products off the land, to make a living there systematically, and that yielded trees that we came later to value. So in terms of an ecological restoration, I mean, maybe I would have come at it the other way. I'd have said, what do the tribes, how did they historically use this land, burn the land? How did they, you know, when, where, why, and how did they do that, so that you're using that knowledge to the land base? And we get the trees, we get the trees. I mean, they were big, they're probably they're widely spaced, open yellow pine, maybe, you know, but I can understand that particularly if you have it, like Kristen was talking about, if you have investments in a tribal mill, boy, you're stuck, because you got to feed the mill.
That's right.
That's a different game. But I just pose that when we talk about ecological restoration, why, and especially because we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge at this conference, why not take the other way, restore the cultural landscape, see what we have, I guess, as opposed to the forester's view of, you know, organizing the forest so that you can get a particular allowable cut off the land. That's just my way of viewing it.
Well, ecological restoration basically falls within the natural range of variability. There's a certain range that allows for forest health conditions. And when I was thinking about that not long ago, and they were constantly talking about this natural range of variability, and they have it on the Confederate Salish, you know, you have to work within this range to allow for sustainability and forest health conditions. I was also taking a look at what is that cultural range of variability, because you would probably see the landscape a whole lot different than maybe I would, and Roy would probably see the landscape and want a different type of harvest treatment, different than, say, I would, and then Kirsten would do the same thing. So what we need to do within taking a look at that forest management is to find some sort of range that is not outside cultural perspectives and norms, but stay within what satisfies the majority of Native people on that landscape. And that's why a multitude of serial stages and stand structure is more applicable than even aged management at times, because you can't really do anything to a square box clear cut, not for at least 150 years anyway.
Other questions for Victoria?
Actually, this kind of tags on with Ron's question, and one of the questions I have, it kind of stems from Jermaine White's talk yesterday. But you know, she was discussing about historical records from both elders and then also from non-natives who were, you know, maybe fur traders who were going down from British Columbia into Montana. And one of the things that she was discussing was that there was instances of human-induced burning throughout the entire year. You know, there would be the natural burning that might occur from lightning strikes during the summer, but she was citing documentation in her DVD where there was definitely burning that was human-caused, that was for management, you know, management in terms of this cultural landscape. And kind of one of the interesting things that I want to ask you about ecological restoration is that, you know, we have agencies like the Forest Service right now where I think there's a dilemma. You know, what exactly are we managing for? You know, even if it's if you look at the wilderness areas as well, even with the wilderness ethic, what are we managing for? And the question I have is, if we are managing, maybe ultimately, if the historic range of variability is really a mechanism of the cultural landscape, then how is it that we can effectively promote that perspective into things outside of just the Native American natural resource base, but our collective North American natural resource base, in terms of making decisions that are not just about adding that cultural perspective into the historical range of variability, because that's really what it was. If you look at the Southwest, it's the large trees are a factor of people burning, and you can transpose that, and that's what people are trying to manage for in some respects. But how do we convey that? How do we take, I guess, this traditional ecological knowledge and have it so it's not just, on reservation boundaries, but, it's introduced and integrated into the federal and state levels as well?
I think that's slowly changing with the laws that have been passed. The forest health laws, for instance, they're taking a look at far beyond just stand structure and taking a look at what is a functionally healthy forest, and then taking a look at also what the long-term sustainable goals are for that particular management scheme. And I think they're moving that direction, but you have to remember that public land resource managers have been schooled traditionally in Western science, hardcore. And it's hard for them to break away because, like Ron earlier said, why do we have to justify traditional ecological knowledge? Sometimes it's just that common sense of looking at what is structurally sound, what kind of habitat types will give you a projection of long-term sustainability, those types of things that we need to take a look at in resource management, both on public and tribal lands. And it's really difficult to do that. It's really difficult to change from a really utilitarian perspective. Now they're embracing ecosystem management, then adaptive ecosystem management, and the philosophy is there. The problem is how do you get a multitude of different types of value from the public into something that will emulate that public perspective? Tribal lands are a little more easier to do, because we have that developed place-based knowledge, and plus we have a cultural similarity, and our epistemological languages and knowledge is in the same trajectory. So what National Forest Service Management, Bureau of Land Management can do is just put that ecosystem on a trajectory that gives you those elements: function, processes, structure, enough structure for change in the future if they decide to change it. We limit ourselves when we only do even age management, And with Germain, with the Confederate Salish and Kootenai, you see all the historical changes that have happened across the landscape over time, And oftentimes ecological restoration has a limited definition, because what you see and what you have, what you see there and what's historically you see there is not the same as what you put functionally on the ground. I am not a keen one to say that even age management or permanent even age management in mixed conifer is the same as doing fire management. I will not embrace that. It's a different type of concept. It's a different type of role. And when you do restore fire on the landscape, you have to look at how many tons per acre you're burning. And if you have 800 tons per acre and you're doing burning, what does that do to your landscape and your soils? So there's a little bit more of a manipulation in ecological restoration that you need to do when you're going to bring back a system to some sort of trajectory.
All right, we got to kind of stay on time here, try to move on, and we have another presentation, I guess, another session here. Please join with me now in thanking Victoria for her presentation.